The courtroom was alive with a quiet hum of anticipation. Journalists scribbled notes, the jury whispered among themselves, and a faint echo of distant conversations filled the air. Judge Clara Everett, a composed and resolute figure in her mid-40 seconds, entered the room and took her seat behind the towering oak bench. Today was supposed to be just another case in her long career of upholding the law. The bailiff stood and announced, "Case number 1187, the state of Louisiana against Gabriel Sanders." Clara flipped through the case file. Assault, armed robbery, and resisting arrest. Her heart sank slightly as she skimmed the charges. Another lost soul tangled in a life of crime, she thought. But the moment Gabriel Sanders walked into the courtroom, her world tilted on its axis. Her hand froze mid-page. There he was, shackled and visibly weary. His face was more lined now, his shoulders slightly hunched, but his eyes, those unmistakable piercing green eyes, told her everything. Gabriel. A flood of memories surged through her like a tidal wave. Clara could almost feel the summer breeze of Madisonville, Louisiana, where they had grown up together. Back then, he was the boy who taught her to climb trees and dream beyond the boundaries of their divided town. Clara blinked, trying to maintain her composure. Gabriel met her gaze briefly, his eyes widening in recognition before quickly looking away, his expression a mixture of shock and resignation. "Mr. Sanders," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "How do you plead?" Gabriel's voice, rough and gravelly, echoed through the room. "Not guilty, Your Honor." At that moment, Clara knew this trial would be like no other, and deep down she couldn't help but wonder what had led him here. What do you think Clara should do? Should she recuse herself, or face her past head-on to seek justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned as the secrets of Clara and Gabriel's intertwined past begin to unravel. The stakes only get higher from here. As the courtroom settled, Clara's thoughts drifted despite her efforts to stay focused. Gabriel Sanders wasn't just another defendant. He was the boy who once climbed trees with her, the one who made her believe they could escape the confines of Madisonville, Louisiana. Madisonville wasn't just small, it was divided. Clara's family lived comfortably on one side of town, while Gabriel's home sat on the outskirts, a dilapidated house surrounded by fields. Their friendship had been an anomaly, forged in secrecy to avoid the judgment of prying neighbors. She still remembered their first meeting by the creek. Clara, a curious 10-year-old, had wandered too far from her backyard and found Gabriel untangling a fishing line. Without hesitation, she had offered to help. And from that moment on, they were inseparable. Their bond, though strong, was tested daily by their town's prejudices. Clara's father made it clear that Gabriel wasn't the right kind of company for his daughter, and when Gabriel's family faced financial struggles that forced them to move, their friendship abruptly ended. Clara's chest tightened as memories flooded back. She forced herself to focus on the trial. The prosecutor began his opening statement, laying out the case against Gabriel with precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that Gabriel Sanders committed this robbery. He was caught near the scene and has a record of prior offenses. This case is simple. The defendant acted out of greed and desperation." Gabriel sat motionless at the defense table, his face betraying no emotion. Evelyn Carter, his defense attorney, rose to speak. "The prosecution will paint a picture of certainty, but this case is riddled with doubt. Gabriel Sanders has pleaded not guilty, and we will show that assumptions, not facts, led to his arrest." The first witness, a store clerk, took the stand and recounted the robbery. "The man was wearing a red hoodie," he said confidently. "He argued with the cashier and then lunged over the counter." Evelyn's cross-examination quickly dismantled his certainty. "You mentioned the man wore a hood. Did you see his face clearly?" The clerk hesitated. "Not exactly. The lights weren't great, and the camera angle wasn't clear." Evelyn pressed further. "So, you cannot say with certainty that Gabriel Sanders was the person who committed the crime?"
"Well, no, I guess not."
Next, the prosecution presented surveillance footage. The grainy video showed a hooded figure entering the store and grabbing something from the counter before running off. Gabriel's face was not visible, but the prosecutor insisted it matched his description. Evelyn countered by pointing out the poor quality of the footage, arguing it was inconclusive. Clara watched closely. The figure moved quickly, almost frantically, but something about it felt off. Gabriel had always been methodical, deliberate. Could desperation have changed him? As the court adjourned for lunch, Clara retreated to her chambers, her mind racing. Sitting at her desk, she opened the case file again, searching for anything that might offer clarity. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Meredith, her assistant, stepped inside. "Judge Everett, everything all right? You seemed a bit distracted earlier." Clara straightened. "Just a challenging case, thank you, Meredith." Meredith hesitated, but said nothing more, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "What happened to you, Gabriel?" she murmured to herself. The afternoon session resumed, and Clara noted Gabriel stealing glances at her from time to time. His face a mixture of caution and something she couldn't quite place. She tightened her grip on the gavel. The trial was only beginning, but the questions swirling in her mind were growing louder. The courtroom was quieter now, the initial tension settling into a focused rhythm. Clara sat rigidly on the bench, her mind split between her duties as a judge and the growing unease bubbling beneath the surface. Evelyn Carter, Gabriel's defense attorney, stood to call the arresting officer, Deputy Alan Harris, to the stand. The seasoned officer entered with a confident stride, his demeanor calm, as if he'd done this 100 times before. "Deputy Harris," Evelyn began, "you were the first officer on the scene and the one who apprehended my client. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Harris replied firmly. "You stated in your report that Mr. Sanders was found 2 blocks from the store shortly after the robbery. What made you suspect him?" "He matched the description given. A man in a red hoodie fleeing the scene." Evelyn nodded, walking closer. "And when you detained Mr. Sanders, did you find anything in his possession that linked him to the crime? Stolen goods, perhaps?" Harris paused, visibly uncomfortable for the first time. "No, we didn't find anything." "So no stolen items, and yet you arrested him. Did you find the red hoodie he was allegedly wearing?" "No," Harris admitted, his tone sharper now. "But it's not unusual for suspects to ditch clothing or evidence before we catch them." Evelyn tilted her head, pressing further. "Did you conduct a thorough search of the area to locate this discarded evidence?" Harris hesitated. "We did a quick sweep, but time was a factor. We couldn't delay processing the suspect." Evelyn stepped back, her voice steady but cutting. "So, to clarify, you arrested Mr. Sanders based solely on a vague description and without any physical evidence tying him to the crime?" The officer's jaw tightened. "He fit the description. That was enough to bring him in for questioning." Evelyn turned to the jury. "Enough for questioning, perhaps. But is it enough to convict a man?" She paused, letting her words sink in before addressing the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." Clara's grip on her gavel tightened. Deputy Harris's testimony left more questions than answers, and she could feel the growing uncertainty in the room. The prosecution called their next witness, a forensic analyst who had reviewed the surveillance footage. The analyst confirmed that the footage showed a person entering the store and committing the robbery. But under cross-examination, Evelyn exposed critical gaps in the testimony. "Can you definitively identify the person in the footage as Gabriel Sanders?" Evelyn asked. "No," the analyst admitted. "The video quality is too poor for a clear identification." Evelyn pressed on. "And was there any indication that the footage had been tampered with or altered?" "There were discrepancies in the timestamp," the analyst replied reluctantly. Clara leaned forward slightly. Discrepancies. That word sent a ripple through her thoughts. If the timestamp was unreliable, how could the video be trusted as evidence? Gabriel sat quietly at the defense table, his face unreadable. But Clara noticed the slight lift in his posture, as though he sensed the cracks in the case widening. The afternoon session ended with a palpable tension hanging in the air. The prosecution's case was beginning to falter, but the question of Gabriel's innocence remained unanswered. As Clara stepped into her chambers, she felt a pang of guilt. She couldn't shake the feeling that Gabriel's fate was tethered to more than just the evidence. It was tangled in a web of assumptions and a justice system that didn't always live up to its name. She reached for her phone, her finger hovering over the number of an old contact from Madisonville. She hadn't spoken to Gabriel in decades, but now she wondered if she should. Should she break the rules just once to understand the truth? The phone stayed on the desk, unanswered, as Clara sat back, lost in thought. Tomorrow would bring more witnesses, more evidence, and perhaps the answers she so desperately sought. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with renewed tension. The prosecution, sensing their case was beginning to unravel, called their star witness to the stand. Mr. John Marshall, the store clerk who claimed to have been attacked during the robbery. Marshall, a wiry man in his late 50s with a nervous demeanor, adjusted his glasses as he sat down. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Mr. Marshall, you were present the night of the robbery, correct?" "Yes," Marshall replied, his voice steady but low. "I was working the register when the man came in. And you've previously stated that the suspect argued with you before lunging over the counter. Is that correct?" "That's right. He grabbed at the cash drawer, and when I tried to stop him, he pushed me back." The prosecutor turned to the jury. "So, to clarify, Mr. Marshall, you were face-to-face with the suspect during the altercation?" Marshall hesitated. "Well, I saw him, but it all happened very fast." The defense attorney, Evelyn Carter, rose swiftly, her expression sharp and focused. "Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine the witness." Clara nodded. "Proceed." Evelyn approached the stand, her tone measured but firm. "Mr. Marshall, you testified that you were face-to-face with the suspect. Can you describe his features for the court?" Marshall fidgeted in his seat. He was wearing a hood, so I couldn't see much. Just his build, mostly." "And was the store well lit during this interaction?" "Not really. The lights near the register were dim, and the camera angles weren't great either." Evelyn stepped closer, her voice calm but insistent. "So, you're saying you couldn't clearly identify the person who robbed the store?" Marshall's hands gripped the edge of the stand. I guess not clearly, no. But it seemed like him. The police said it was him." "The police said," Evelyn repeated, pausing for effect. "Mr. Marshall, can you say with absolute certainty, under oath, that Gabriel Sanders is the man who attacked you?" Marshall's face reddened. "No, I can't. Not absolutely." Evelyn turned to the jury. "Thank you. No further questions." Clara glanced at the jury. A few members exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable. The cracks in the prosecution's case were widening, but the doubts still lingered. The next witness, a forensic analyst, was called back to clarify discrepancies in the surveillance footage. Evelyn wasted no time exposing the holes. "Mr. Bates," Evelyn began, her voice steady, "you previously testified that the footage had timestamp discrepancies. Can you explain what caused them?" Bates shifted uncomfortably. "The footage was recorded on an older system. The timestamps occasionally reset during power surges." "So the timestamp might not accurately reflect the time of the robbery?" "Yes, that's correct." Evelyn pressed on. "And are you able to definitively identify the suspect in the video as my client?" "No, the video quality is too poor for that," Bates admitted. Clara felt the weight of the room shift. The evidence, once seemingly ironclad, now felt like sand slipping through fingers. As the court recessed for the day, Gabriel approached Evelyn at the defense table. "Do you think it's enough?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're building doubt, Gabriel. That's all we need." Clara watched from the bench, her heart heavy. She had always believed in the justice system, in its ability to find the truth. But now, for the first time, she wondered if the system could truly grasp the complexities of a man's life. Returning to her chambers, Clara sifted through Gabriel's file, rereading every detail. His past arrests were minor, loitering, petty theft, nothing violent. The picture painted by the prosecution didn't align with the Gabriel she remembered. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the trial pressing down on her. Gabriel's life hung in the balance, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was just out of reach. Tomorrow, the defense would call its final witnesses, and Clara knew the trial was heading toward its most pivotal moments. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the defense prepared to call their final witnesses. Gabriel sat silently at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly, as Evelyn Carter stood to address the court. "Your Honor, I would like to call Deputy Alan Harris back to the stand," Evelyn announced, her tone sharp with intent. Deputy Harris appeared calm as he returned to the stand, but Clara could see the faint unease in his posture. Evelyn wasted no time. "Deputy Harris, during your previous testimony, you stated that Mr. Sanders was arrested because he fit the description of the suspect. Is that correct?" "Yes," Harris replied curtly. "And that description was based on the video footage and eyewitness account?" Evelyn pressed. "Correct," Harris said, his voice steady. Evelyn approached the stand, her tone growing sharper. "Deputy Harris, are you aware that the surveillance footage contains timestamp discrepancies?" I was informed of that later, yes," Harris admitted, shifting slightly in his seat. "And despite this, you made no effort to corroborate the timing of the events or search for additional evidence that might confirm Mr. Sanders' guilt or innocence." Harris hesitated. "We acted on the information we had at the time." Evelyn nodded, her expression unreadable. "Did you consider that Mr. Sanders might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time? That he could have been an innocent man fitting a vague description?" Harris bristled. "We followed standard procedure." Evelyn stepped back, her voice cutting through the courtroom. "Standard procedure that could have cost an innocent man his freedom. No further questions, Your Honor." The room was silent as Harris left the stand, his confidence shaken. Clara could feel the weight of Evelyn's words settling over the jury. Gabriel's case was no longer about evidence alone. It was about the flaws in a system built on assumptions. Evelyn then called her final witness, a forensic expert who had conducted an independent review of the surveillance footage. The expert's testimony was damning. "The figure in the video appears to have a different build than Mr. Sanders," the expert explained, pointing to a comparison of Gabriel's silhouette against the suspect's. "Additionally, the timestamps are inconsistent with the timeline of the robbery, suggesting potential tampering or errors in the footage." The prosecution attempted to discredit the testimony, but the damage was done. Clara watched as members of the jury exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, Evelyn addressed the court. "Your Honor, I would like to call the defendant, Gabriel Sanders, to testify." Gabriel hesitated for a moment before rising, the chains around his ankles clinking softly as he approached the stand. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but steady. "I've made mistakes in my life," he began, his gaze fixed on the jury. "But I didn't do this. I wasn't in that store. I've been fighting my whole life, against poverty, against judgment, against a system that sees me as guilty before it sees me as a person." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I didn't take anything that night, and I didn't hurt anyone. All I ask is for you to look beyond the assumptions and see the truth." Gabriel's words hung in the air long after he stepped down. Clara felt her throat tighten as she looked at him. The boy she had once known was still there, buried beneath years of hardship and survival. As the court adjourned for the day, the weight of the trial was heavier than ever. The next day would bring closing arguments and the verdict. Clara sat alone in her chambers, staring at her gavel. She had always believed in the justice system, but now she wondered if it was capable of truly serving justice. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they painted was far from clear. And Clara knew that the decisions made in the coming hours would define more than just Gabriel's future. They would test the very foundation of her beliefs. The final day of the trial dawned heavy with anticipation. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as the jury filed back into their seats. Clara sat at the bench, her face calm but her mind racing. The hours ahead would determine not only Gabriel's fate, but also the credibility of the justice system she had dedicated her life to. Evelyn Carter rose to deliver her closing argument. Her voice was steady, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is not about proving the impossible. It is about doubt, reasonable doubt. The prosecution has failed to provide concrete evidence that Gabriel Sanders committed this crime. The eyewitness testimony is uncertain, the surveillance footage is unreliable, and no physical evidence links my client to the scene." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But more importantly, this case is about fairness. Gabriel Sanders is a man who has been judged his entire life, not for what he has done, but for who he is. Today, you have the chance to look past the assumptions and do what is right. I trust you to make the just decision." The jury's faces were inscrutable, but the weight of her words lingered in the air. The prosecutor, visibly frustrated, delivered his closing statement with fervor. "This is not about assumptions," he argued. "This is about evidence. Gabriel Sanders was found near the scene of the crime, matching the description of the perpetrator. The defense wants you to ignore the facts, but the facts are clear. Gabriel Sanders committed this crime, and justice demands accountability." When the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with whispered speculation. Gabriel sat silently, his hands clasped tightly together, while Evelyn leaned in to reassure him. Clara watched from the bench, her heart heavy. Hours passed. The jury's deliberation dragged on, and every passing minute felt like an eternity. When they finally returned, the room fell silent. The foreperson stood, holding a slip of paper that seemed to tremble in their hands. "In the case of the state of Louisiana against Gabriel Sanders, we find the defendant." A pause that stretched forever. "Not guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Gabriel's shoulders sagged, his hands trembling as he exhaled deeply. Evelyn placed a comforting hand on his arm, whispering words Clara couldn't hear. Clara tapped her gavel, bringing the room to order. "The jury has spoken. Mr. Sanders, you are free to go." Her voice was steady, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. As the courtroom emptied, Gabriel lingered, his eyes meeting Clara's for the first time since the trial began. He walked toward her, hesitating before speaking. "Judge Everett," he began, his voice low, "I know you had to stay impartial, but it meant something, seeing you up there. I thought you'd forgotten me." Clara stood, stepping down from the bench. "I could never forget, Gabriel. I only wish." She trailed off, searching for the right words. "I wish I'd done more back then. I'm sorry." Gabriel nodded slowly, a faint, weary smile crossing his face. "We can't change the past, but thanks for being fair. That's more than I've gotten in a long time." He turned to leave, but Clara stopped him. "Gabriel, what will you do now?" He paused, his back still to her. "Start over. I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out." As he walked out of the courtroom, the fading sunlight streaming through the doors, Clara felt a weight lift and another settle in its place. She had done her duty, but the trial had exposed cracks in the system she once believed was unshakable. Later that evening, sitting in her chambers, Clara stared at the photo on her desk, a young Gabriel and her, smiling under the pecan tree. She thought about the countless others like him, people who might never get the chance to prove their innocence, trapped by the same system she upheld. She picked up her pen and began drafting a proposal for judicial reform, a renewed sense of purpose igniting within her. Justice wasn't just about verdicts, she realized. It was about the people whose lives were shaped by those decisions. And she vowed to ensure the future held more than just hollow promises of fairness. Thank you so much for staying with us through this powerful and emotional journey. Stories like these remind us of the complexities of justice, the weight of choices, and the impact we have on one another. If this story moved you, or if you found yourself reflecting on the twists and turns of Gabriel and Clara's journey, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Clara's position? Do you think justice was truly served? And hey, if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more thought-provoking, heartfelt tales like this, don't forget to give this video a like. It really helps us share these stories with more people who value meaningful narratives like you do. Make sure to subscribe to Elderly Wisdom and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story. We're all about bringing you stories that stir your heart, spark your mind, and connect us all. Finally, if you know someone who would love this story, share it with them. Let's keep the conversation going and build a community of people who appreciate the lessons life has to offer. Thank you for being part of our journey. Until next time, take care and stay.